Rosemarie is a professor at Emory University and is one of the leading people thinking about disability studies. And I just want to take this moment with our Diversity Summit to kind of reflect on how new things come into our discussion. And I showed earlier our definition of diversity and all of the things that it included. But I think truly for us to live up to that broad definition, there's work to be done in many areas. And I guess I'd call it the good fortune of driving up to DIA yesterday because we were worried about Rosemarie getting here and had a chance to visit in the car a little bit. And you can read about her many accomplishments. I think you're going to really appreciate Rosemarie as a person, and I'm so glad she could join us today. So please welcome Rosemarie.
So thank you very much, Key, for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come here to participate in the Diversity Summit. It's a terrific concept. I'm honored to be here. I want to, in particular, thank, as I said, Key for being, and the Office of Diversity and now we say Inclusion, for the invitation to come, the opportunity. I'd like to thank my colleague and friend Emily Nussbaum for helping to coordinate my visit. And I'd also like to thank the Departments of Sociology, Women and Ethnic Studies, and the Matrix Center for coordinating a series of workshops and presentations in association with the Diversity Summit here that I think are very productive. It's been really enjoyable for me to learn what kinds of diversity initiatives are being brought forward here on this particular campus and to contribute in some way to thinking about how these various diversity initiatives can all work together in our goal of creating a more accessible world that is more socially just. So, as I said, thank you very much, and thank you for all coming. Please feel free to eat and to relax and to share in my presentation. So my title here is Out and About in Spheres of Learning, How Disability Integration Transforms Public Space. What I'm presenting to you today can be looked at in two ways. One is that it's in some ways a brief history of disability in public. Another way of thinking about my presentation here today is that I'm going to give you a series of what I sometimes call disability stories. Now, stories, of course, we know, are explanations. They're ways that we understand the world that we live in, the way we understand our own lives, ourselves, and others. Stories, in other words, help us make sense of our lives. And of course, because the human variations that we think of as disabilities are so really fundamental to every life, our culture has many, many stories about disability that have evolved in response to changing cultural developments and patterns. So part of what I'm going to talk about are these stories of disability and to give them names. So for most of history, disabled people out in the public world have been beggars. In fact, historically, access to economic resources for people with disabilities came from public begging or sometimes from private family resources. The figure of the crippled beggar has been made familiar to us, of course, in many cultural settings by well-known artworks in particular, such as this 1525 painting by Peter Bruegel or the famous 1916 photograph of a blind beggar by the American photographer Paul Strand. From ancient to modern times, disabled people have also been displayed, and I've done a lot of work in this area. I think it's really very interesting, in public as objects of wonder for entertainment. In the 19th century, for example, a set of enslaved, conjoined twin women who had the stage name Millie Christine were part of a popular culture of curiosities who performed as entertainment before audiences across the country. They were the kind of the first disability celebrities in Western culture. So similarly, the couple with the stage name Maximo and Bartola, who we would consider today probably people with developmental disabilities, were displayed as what were called the Aztec children in the 19th century. People of color, in particular, with what I call spectacular or unusual disabilities, such as these entertainers, and of course the very famous original so-called Siamese Twins, were the most sought after of these performers because they seemed doubly exotic to audiences who were fascinated by these extraordinary sights. The development of scientific medicine gained authority, as we all know, in the late 19th century as a way to understand humanity and a way to interpret human variation. So at the same time that people with disabilities were being displayed for entertainment as curiosities, they were also being used as medical specimens, as I'm showing you here in early medical photographs of Millie Christine and Maximo and Bartola. So stripping them, these subjects, of their dignified costuming and their posing in the entertainment discourse de-emphasizes their faces, and it exposes the parts of their bodies that are understood as medical anomalies, and thus dehumanizes them by presenting them in these medical contexts. The idea of normal, and with it, of course, its opposite, the idea of abnormal, are the primary ways that we understand disability in our modern era. So this concept of normal is derived from statistical averages and in fact, most people, most human beings, depart from normal in all ways. What gets considered abnormal, of course, becomes highly stigmatized according to this medical model of human variation with which we're all familiar. In the first half of the 20th century, disability is primarily understood, especially in the Western context, as a medical condition to be cured, and disabled people are treated largely in hospitals, and they're confined to institutions. Charity and sympathy are the most common responses in the first half of the 20th century to disability and to disabled people. Organizations, for example, such as the March of Dimes, tell a story of cure and a story of sympathy in campaigns that want to eliminate disability through medical treatment. The very most negative version of disability as pathology, which I've mentioned, is the supposed science, the pseudoscience of eugenics, which arose in the late 1800s in the West and came to prominence in the Western world in general in the first decades of the 20th century as a progressive, and this is important, scientific and political initiative that would supposedly improve, this was the term that was used, the human race by encouraging people of so-called higher value, the valued citizens, to reproduce, and also by eliminating the people of so-called lower value. Now, Germany and the United States collaborated on eugenic research and reproductive policies such as forced sterilization in the first decades of the 20th century. Nazi Germany took eugenic thinking, of course, to its logical conclusion by developing a eugenic euthanasia program to exterminate people that it considered unfit. This Nazi propaganda poster that I'm presenting captures the logic of eugenics by using the authority of statistics, and remember I mentioned the authority of statistics in establishing normal as the criteria that we achieve or try to achieve, to predict the large growth of, so this statistics predicted the large growth of the supposedly inferior populations in Germany, in contrast with the shrinking populations of the supposed inferior people, or superior people, sorry. Nazi Germany's first eugenic project to advance the so-called Aryan race was to round up Germans who had disabilities in institutions that ranged from orphanages to medical care facilities, and to transfer them to extermination facilities, where the Nazis, in cooperation with medical practitioners, and this is very important, developed the gas chambers and the sham medical examinations, which were later used in the more ambitious Nazi project to exterminate the Jews of Europe and other groups who were considered to be eugenically inferior. By the mid-20th century, however, our emerging collective knowledge of the Holocaust discredited eugenics as a formal science. The concept of progressive politics shifted in the U.S. and elsewhere, but I'm going to concentrate a bit here on the U.S. Beginning in the 1950s and the 1960s, from the eugenic project of eliminating stigmatized groups from the national population to including a wider variety of people who had been previously excluded by segregation laws, by discriminatory attitudes, and by structural exclusions. The larger civil and human rights movement in the U.S. and elsewhere emerged in various forms in mid-century, creating legislation, changing practices, and demanding the inclusion of previously excluded groups, including women, African Americans, people with disabilities, sexual minorities, and other ethnic and minority groups. The disability rights movement emerged then in tandem with other civil rights movements in primarily the 1960s and the 1970s. Its focus was to integrate people with disabilities into the public sphere by removing architectural barriers, by creating an accessible built environment, by desegregating public education and the workplace, and by providing anti-discriminatory legislation. The inclusive built environment that began to appear in the 1960s, starting primarily in the U.S. with the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, made it possible for people with disabilities to literally enter the public sphere in order to exercise the rights and the obligations of democratic citizenship. The very idea of according civil and human rights to people with disabilities transformed what I'm calling here the stories of disability as exclusively a charity or a medical issue. It transformed these stories dramatically. So while these stories about disability certainly persist now in our sort of public understanding of disability, new stories about disability have flourished, and I'm going to focus on those newer stories, those newer narratives of disability for the remainder of my talk. For example, the breast cancer movement used political understandings of disability to demand recognition and treatment for breast cancer, beginning in the 1970s through beginning in the 1970s with women activists who displayed mastectomy scars as a form of social protest, and they extend even today through the many pink ribbon movements that we're familiar with. In 1993, for example, the fashion model and breast cancer survivor, named Matushka, appeared on the cover of the Sunday New York Times Magazine, bearing the marks of breast cancer, her mastectomy scars, with the headline that said very boldly, "You can't look away anymore." So with that, breast cancer begins to appear in public. Although full integration and equality is always, of course, an aspirational ideal, as we know, in a democratic society, the concept of disabled people as a minority group entitled to civil and human rights has changed our shared disability stories, if you will, quite significantly. The traditional story, the traditional narrative, the traditional understanding of disabled people as inspirational, for example, has moved in part from a story of cure, for example, such as the March of Dimes would have presented in the 1930s, to one in which disabled people live successfully with disabilities rather than trying to eliminate those disabilities. And this is a significant shift that's part of a positive disability politics that emerges in the 1960s with the larger disability rights movement and the larger civil rights movement. So a recent series of inspirational ads, for example, replaced the sympathy narrative with dignity, such as images of, and I really like this young woman who's got her 15 minutes of fame and become a celebrity as a result of her becoming disabled. Her name is Bethany Hamilton. She proudly displays her disability, which is to say her amputated arm, which she lost to a shark while she was surfing in Hawaii. And apparently there is a wonderful film about her life, which the name of which, of course, has flown out of my head, and I don't have it in my notes. But she's quite a well-known celebrity, certainly among our students, as I'm given to understand. So the kind of traditional stories that I've been presenting to you about disability and the images that carry them, of course, continue to persist today in tandem with these new, what I call, civil and human rights stories. So disability has always been an opportunity for vivid and succinct metaphors. So I'm an English professor, and this is my favorite part. For example, many of the terms that we use today as a kind of shorthand to discredit something are unrecognized references to disability. When we want to say something is bad or wrong or to discredit it in some way, we often call it disability metaphors, such as lame, a lame idea. We call things stupid. We call things dumb, crazy, blind, insane, idiotic, moronic, retarded, all of which are words for different kinds of what we think of as disabilities. Stock disabled characters, such as the blind beggar that I've talked about, are taken up as ways to discredit, such as this fabulous economical cartoon from a recent New York Times, which uses the blind beggar figure, gets refashioned in this political cartoon as an elephant. So it's an elephant dressed like a blind beggar, and it's used to criticize the Republican Party's supposed lack of vision. And I think it's a really wonderful cartoon. There's the glasses that are associated with the blind beggar figure. There is the tin cup, and around the neck of this Republican elephant figure is a sign that says "No Vision," which is a reference to the Paul Strand photograph that says "blind" on it from 1916. And perhaps most significant is the blind beggar elephant figure that is tripping a passerby down in the corner of the cartoon, to suggest, of course, that this is not just a blind beggar, but it's a fake blind beggar, which is part of the history of blind beggars as fakes, as people who are trying to get money by pretending to be disabled. So this is part of the discriminatory discourse of disability. And of course, this passes without comment, as simply a vivid metaphor. So because disability is both, as I've suggested, omnipresent in human experience, and also it's a very intense aspect of the human condition, it's been taken up quite frequently as an occasion for drama and for effective meaning-making in art, in theater, in literature, in film, and of course in advertising, as I think we've seen a little bit of. For example, one of the founding stories of Western literature is Oedipus the King, who was a disabled character. He was a character with lameness and, of course, with blindness at the end of the story. And these characters who are disabled throughout Western history lend both theatricality and symbolism to a variety of stories that are founding stories of Western culture. So one of the many theatrical uses that I'm working on now myself of disability in American culture is the very popular folk opera Porgy and Bess, which depends for its effectiveness on the character Porgy's disability to mark him as both distinctive and noble and to drive forward the plot. And I'm showing a representation here of the recent Porgy and Bess that was performed on Broadway in 2011 in conversation with the 1959 film portrayal of Porgy by Sidney Poitier. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition. So this has been a long visual discourse of disability around Porgy and Bess, and of course of a discourse of race and disability representation. Race and gender representation at the same time. So it's a very fruitful source for analysis. So one influential post-civil rights disability story that has been taken up in popular media, advertising, and commercial culture casts disability as a form of cultural diversity. And this is, in some ways, the most productive set of images and possibilities I think that we might consider here today, given the fact that we are present at a diversity summit, which again is a wonderful concept. And these images and cultural products cast disability, as I said, as a form of cultural diversity. Television programs featuring disabled characters who are neither tragic nor evil, such as the television program, which isn't on anymore, of course, they come and go, called Life Goes On, which starred the actor Chris Burke, who has Down syndrome, reflect both the idea and the reality that people with disabilities are integrated into the mainstream world. Perhaps the surest indicator, of course, of the entry into the realm of cultural diversity of any group is to be represented in the Barbie pantheon, which occurred with the emergence in 1997 of Share a Smile Becky, which is interesting, not Barbie, but actually Becky, a separate character, who appeared in her fashionable pink and purple wheelchair. It's worth noting, of course, that Becky, along with her sensible shoes and legs that bend at the knee, may be the only truly feminist Barbie doll. So more recently, popular television programs such as Glee introduced disabled characters to add both, and I think this is really important, a kind of hip diversity and a cheerful theatricality to their plots. Whether the wheelchair-using character named Artie Abrams will get a date to the dance, or whether the aspiring cheerleader with Down syndrome will be selected for the team, drive forward the drama, and they add interest to Glee, which is basically a comedy. And having disabled characters in a comedy as opposed to a tragedy, I think, is quite politically progressive. So the show also benefits, of course, from the publicity surrounding controversies about non-disabled actors playing disabled roles and about disabled actors such as Lauren Potter she's the person who plays the cheerleader, the woman with Down syndrome, finding non-disabled roles. So it's an opportunity for public conversation, especially in teaching, around some of the politics of representation and inclusion in terms of disability. So the entry I'm submitting here of disabled people into the world and into the media has produced a cadre of disabled celebrities whose stories and whose images range much beyond earlier disabled celebrities such as Helen Keller. So one example, and I like to talk a lot about this example, is the fashion model, the actress, the champion runner, and the TED speaker, whose name is Aimee Mullins. Aimee Mullins has very much fashion model looks. She looks eerily like a Barbie doll, and she has a shape, this Barbie-esque shape. Mullins is also, and this is really what's interesting, a double amputee from just below the knee. She quips that disability is actually a great advantage as a fashion model because she can make herself as tall as she wants to be. She has prosthetic legs that range from fashion to cosmetic that are really interesting, and she displays her disability and these prosthetic legs always as a part of her chic image. And she uses, as I've suggested, this wide variety of fashion legs in order to make a distinctive style for herself. The famous designer, for example, Alexander McQueen, has fashioned a number of high fashion outfits for Mullins that accentuate her disability as part of a general fashion statement. So disabled people have entered and transformed, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a slide behind here. So some images I'm presenting of Mullins here, giving her TED talk and displaying some of her various legs and with her costumes that Alexander McQueen has designed for her. Disabled people have entered and transformed sports as well, as have women, of course, since Title IX in this post-civil rights era. For example, South African runner Oscar Pistorius, who has been in the news recently in the most unfortunate of circumstances, challenged the Olympic Committee to be allowed to compete in the Olympics, and in fact did compete in the Olympics as well as the Paralympics that were held in London last summer. Although the case is still being worked out in detail, the Olympic Committee, and this is the interesting part, initially refused Pistorius on the basis that his prosthetic legs would give him an advantage over runners with fleshly legs. And what this brings forward is the interesting idea that disability might be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Also in the same vein, the South African runner named Caster Semenya presented the question of whether biological gender ambiguity, and again this case is still being discussed and emerging, which is of course traditionally gender ambiguity, which is traditionally called hermaphroditism, might pose an advantage rather than a disadvantage in sport. So these are very interesting. Disability sports is very interesting, emerging cultural discourse, I think, to follow. One of the most interesting, in my view, and of course controversial, uses of what I'm calling disability theatricality comes from none other than Lady Gaga, who has kind of displaced Barbie in some ways in popular culture. And Lady Gaga uses disability prosthetics, such as wheelchairs, crutches, eye patches, as sensationalist fashion accessories and costuming in her music videos and in her live performances. For example, in July of 2011, Lady Gaga rolled out for performances in Sydney, Australia, using a wheelchair, and she was egged apparently by her audiences who thought that, I guess, she crossed some sort of line between her signature outrageousness and an offensive appropriation of disability by using this wheelchair as part of her extravagant costuming. The question, in my view, that is most interesting is whether Lady Gaga's, what I call prosthetic accessorizing, is discrimination as some kind of a form of disability drag or minstrelsy, or whether it's, and I would come down on this understanding I would support this understanding, is a creative costuming that indicates that disability prosthetics have moved out of the stigmatized world of medical treatment and into the edgy, high fashion culture of costuming. In the last decade, disability has been appearing not only in popular culture, but in public art. In 2005, for example, a controversial statue called Alison Lapper Pregnant by British artist, well-known British artist, Mark Quinn, won a prestigious public art competition that placed it in one of the most famous sites of public conversation in the Western world, and that is Trafalgar Square in London. The statue, which was on display but has been cycled out, follows one of the most traditional sets of conventions in Western art, the nude marble statue of a woman on a pedestal. However, this woman, Alison Lapper, who herself is an artist, is not only significantly disabled, but she's pregnant. The statue thus fuses an expected art form, and this is my point, with an unexpected subject, and it thus produces a kind of artistic hybrid that is both original and compelling. The statue, therefore, fulfilled a really important purpose of public art by posing questions for public debate about, for example, what's an appropriate subject of art? What kinds of people might be represented appropriately in public space? Who has been left out of representation in public space? And perhaps most crucially, who and who should not be reproducing and parenting in our particular cultural moment? Alison Lapper Pregnant, the name of the statue, also gains its authority from its reference to the most famous double upper amputee in the history of Western art, and that is the Venus de Milo, who has been on display before the public for many years in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So the sculptor and artist Mark Quinn's statue has benefited, interestingly, the career of Alison Lapper, who is a photographer as well as an artist. So the handless Alison Lapper has recently published an autobiography that I think has one of the best ever ironic titles for a life-writing narrative, and it's called My Life in My Hands. And of course, Alison Lapper is handless. I've worked a lot on traditional Western portraiture in relation to people with disabilities. So portraiture is a way of commemorating and honoring the subjects of these portraits. Disability rights and cultural leaders are beginning to be celebrated in this traditional art form of the portrait. So a portrait, for example, of the playwright and author Susan Nussbaum by artist Riva Lehrer gains resonance and it gains authority, similarly to Alison Lapper Pregnant, by making a reference to one of the most famous portraits of the 20th century, and that is Pablo Picasso's 1906 portrait of the seated Buddha-like Gertrude Stein. So Gertrude Stein's solidity in this portrait and her engaged, leaning in posture, for which she's very famous and for which Picasso is very famous in this portrait, is replicated by Riva Lehrer in her portrait of Susan Nussbaum, who is seated equally solidly to Gertrude Stein, but seated in her wheelchair. Unusual, or particularly theatrical, as I call them, disabilities have often been made the subject of photography because, of course, they further photography's expression of realism. the American photographer Diane Arbus, photographed unusual disabled people such as Eddie Carmel, the so-called Jewish giant, in this really famous photograph that many of us are familiar with. The effect of Eddie Carmel's size is accentuated in Arbus's photograph very effectively by his juxtaposition to his parents placed in their living room. And of course, the parents and the living room become diminutive, miniaturized by the presence of the very large Eddie Carmel. The photographer Annie Leibovitz, who is a photographer, of course, and a political activist, who is a photographer of unusual people, photographed the political activist named Jennifer Miller, a bearded woman whose beard may be called, a term that I use, an appearance impairment. And Leibovitz produced a very striking portrait of Jennifer Miller, a nude portrait in which Miller's beard, which of course is the traditional mark of masculinity, opposes in this nude photograph the triangular pubic area, which is the traditional mark of femininity. And these photographs both achieve a kind of dramatic effect then by accentuating these atypical forms of human variation that can be considered as disabilities. The photographer Kevin Conley, I've done some research on his work. He was born legless, and he travels the world on a kind of low-riding skateboard that he prefers to use to a wheelchair for mobility. And he has reversed in his photographs the photographic gaze, the traditional photographic gaze, that was established, for example, by photographers such as Diane Arbus. This is what Kevin Conley does. He's gone around the world in his travels photographing thousands of people that he has captured with his photographic gaze looking at him. So this distinctive angle of his camera captures the surprise in the faces and the postures of the people looking at him as he turns back their gaze toward him upon them to reveal their surprise as they encounter such an unusual person, and this is the important thing, out and about wielding a camera in the public world. Disabled people, of course, have always contributed to making culture, and this is a really important point. But they have not often been recognized as disabled people, and their influence and the influence of their disabilities have not often been recognized in art and the making of culture. For example, the French Impressionist artist Claude Monet developed low vision in later life, as of course most people do. As his vision changed, however, his paintings changed as well to become not only less focused, but, of course, most significantly, more impressionistic. Disability, and this is one of my most important points, often prompts artistic creativity and other forms of creativity, and evolution and what we might call problem solving, innovation, because it affects and it often changes the relationship between an artist's body and that artist's work. The contemporary artist, for example, Chuck Close, known as the founder of photographic realism, evolved a style of painting that arose from the changes in his body that came from paralysis. Now, Chuck Close's early self-portraits were composed according to a very fine grid, and as he became disabled, his hand required a larger grid, a much larger grid, that produced a different kind of portrait. Disability has promoted, in fact, it's demanded that Chuck Close evolve his art, change his artistic practice. The disability story here that I'm drawing from Chuck Close's artistic production is that Close continues to make his art not in spite of his disabilities, but because of his disabilities. Disability acts here then as a prompt, I've suggested, for resourcefulness, for adaptability, and for creativity, not necessarily as a lack or a limitation, which are these older stories that I've been suggesting are being displaced with a post-civil rights understanding of disability and disability rights and disability inclusion. The entry of disability into contemporary dance is, I think, one of the most vibrant new forms of disability culture to be produced and to show us how disability can evolve artistic form. So the introduction of the wheelchair into contemporary dance, it's been suggested, is the most important technological innovation since the invention of the toe shoe in ballet. There are many disability integrated dance companies. Sometimes it's called disability dance, sometimes it's called integrated dance, sometimes it's called mixed ability dance. I'm actually quite interested in several forms of disability dance. One is the disabled dancer whose name is Bill Shannon, who goes by the stage name, I love this, Crutch Man. He's also evolved a new dance form using crutches that he requires for mobility in fashioning them with a rocker bottom. So he uses traditional crutches that he has put a rocker bottom on in order to evolve a new form of breakdancing choreography and a whole set of moves that are very distinctive to not only his body but to the prosthetic crutches that he uses for mobility and that he uses for dancing. So Shannon's dancing is so compelling that it has been used in mainstream advertising for a really interesting ad that you can take a look at on YouTube for Visa credit cards. It's actually rather controversial. So perhaps the most radical and counterintuitive, I want to say, disability story, I'm going to end with this, that I want to offer you today, is what I call the story of disability as beauty. The late activist and disability rights lawyer named Harriet McBride Johnson wrote about living as a significantly disabled person. What she wrote is, "I guess it's natural enough," she said, "that most people don't know what to make of us." She means people with disabilities out in public. She says, 2 or 3 times in my life, I have been looked at as a kind of rare beauty. I was quite taken by this concept of rare beauty, and I wrote about it in the book I wrote on staring. And I wanted to end with some images that I'll describe to you and offer to you from art and photography and painting that capture in some ways this rare beauty that can be found, I submit, in disability. And this rare beauty emerges from distinctiveness, I want to suggest, rather than from ordinariness. It arises from struggle rather than comfort, and it arises from the unusual and the unexpected rather than the usual. And I have here 2 images. One is from a fashion shoot done by Nick Knight, based on fashions designed by Alexander McQueen. I had presented to you and talked a little bit earlier about Aimee Mullins, who Alexander McQueen designed costumes for. So I think it's a very effective and affecting portrait of a woman of small stature who has a very distinctive asymmetrical hairstyle, a very asymmetrical body, a very asymmetrical, let's say, evening gown. She's seated, and she presents herself engaging directly the gaze of her audience with her eyes, a very sophisticated, a very dignified look. This woman is a very unusual person that we don't typically see in conjunction with the visual discourses of high fashion. And I want to submit that this is an interesting intervention in the way that public images and public discourses present disability to us. The other photograph that I'm presenting here comes from Integrated Dance. This is a dance company out of New York called GIMP. It is a photograph, a very interesting photograph of a woman who's a dancer named Catherine Long. She is a one-armed woman, and she's posed in a black outfit of contemporary dance. Her head is off to the side. She's a very upright pose, and her left shoulder, or her left arm, which you might say ends in a shoulder, which is pointed a little bit. A very interesting and very unusual form of embodiment that's very hard for us to visually recognize here. It's a very unreadable photograph. Her arm, which is very short, we might say her stump, her amputated arm, is pointing upwards, and her fully extended arm, her right arm, is hanging downward in this really interesting, very sculptural pose that brings forward what I want to suggest might be the unusualness of disability beauty. And I think I might have, I have another few images that I might share with you if we have another minute or two. These are some portraits that I have been working on of people with disabilities. And interesting, some portraits of people with significant disabilities, a portrait of a woman of small stature sitting on a wall, a kind of Humpty Dumpty image, a portrait of a person with significant burn scarring, which is a series of portraits of burn survivors which were commissioned, and a portrait of a woman with a very unusual face, dressed in a very dignified costume of what I call the vamp. Thank you.